He was lost in the rugged wilderness, his deaf ears only able to catch the vibration of his own frantic heartbeat, and a wild Mustang was his final lifeline. What happened next left an entire town utterly speechless. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. He had a name, Eli Walker. The day had started peacefully enough, with bright sunshine glazing the vast meadows around his small hometown, a place bordered by dense woods and rocky hills that stretched to the horizon. That morning, Eli had set off alone, as he often did on weekends, exploring the outskirts of town in search of small wonders, unique rocks, hidden streams, or quiet corners where the birds would congregate. Being deaf presented challenges, and his parents worried about him venturing out without a companion, but Eli felt at home in the wilderness. It was the one place where he didn't feel judged for the silence that enveloped him. On this particular day, he walked further than usual, stepping off familiar trails into an uncharted part of the woods, drawn by something he could only describe as an irresistible pull. The air changed quickly, growing heavier and cooler. Dark clouds swept across the sky like silent ghosts, and the sun was swallowed by thick gloom. A warning prickle ran through Eli's skin. He couldn't hear thunder, but he felt it. The vibration hummed through the ground, and he realized a massive storm was rolling in faster than he had anticipated. He turned to head back, but the path he had come from seemed to vanish, overtaken by shifting shadows. He trudged in the direction he believed was home, yet every step seemed to lead him deeper into unknown territory. He caught flickers of movement out of the corner of his eye, branches swaying, small animals scurrying. The wind was picking up, rustling the leaves, stirring the dust. Panic started to coil around him. He couldn't call for help in a traditional way, and with no cell phone reception, he was on his own. Low-hanging branches whipped at his face. The darkness turned the late afternoon into something that felt more like midnight. Instinctively, Eli's senses heightened. Though he was deaf, he attuned to the subtle vibrations in the air, the shifting of the ground beneath him, and the trembling in his chest that served as his internal alarm. At one point, he stumbled upon a small clearing with a few scattered boulders. He paused there, trying to catch his breath and calm his pounding heart. Above, swirling gray clouds threatened to unleash a deluge. He sensed movement again, more significant this time, something larger than a fox or a deer. Shifting his gaze, he spotted a sleek form in the distance. At first, it seemed like just another shadow dancing in the gloom. But as it moved closer, he recognized the contour of a massive wild Mustang. The animal's muscles rippled beneath the dark coat, its mane whipped by the wind, giving it a near-mythical appearance. Eli had seen wild horses before, but never up close. The Mustangs in this region were known to roam free in the highlands, rarely venturing too close to human civilization. This one, however, was clearly drawn by something, maybe curiosity, maybe suspicion. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know whether to remain still or slowly back away. He sensed a kind of energy in the horse's eyes, a mixture of challenge and concern. The Mustang snorted, pawed the ground as if to test the boy's intentions. Cautiously, Eli took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Thunder, felt more than heard, rumbled through the earth. The horse jerked its head, ears flicking. Perhaps it felt the same urgency that Eli did. They were two vulnerable creatures on the brink of a storm's fury, locked in mutual uncertainty. Then, out of the corner of his vision, Eli noticed a flicker of movement. It was fast, predatory. A shape slinking among the tree trunks, low and methodical. The realization sliced through him like a blade. A mountain lion had emerged from the depths of the forest. Eli could see the cat's powerful shoulders rolling beneath tawny fur, its tail swishing. He felt his adrenaline surge. A wild Mustang was already an unexpected sight, but a mountain lion in the same clearing meant immediate danger. Eli had no weapon, nowhere to hide. The lion's focus darted between the Mustang and the boy. It seemed uncertain which target was more accessible. Then the wind shifted, carrying the boy's scent, and the cat locked its gaze on him. Eli's instincts screamed for him to run, but he knew better. Predators chase fleeing prey, and he had nowhere to run. The Mustang, a few yards away, sensed the threat too. Its body went rigid, muscles taut, nostrils flared. Eli stood perfectly still, willing his body not to tremble. His eyes flicked between the lion and the horse. The lion crept closer, each step calculated. Then, with an explosive burst of energy, the mountain lion lunged. In that crucial moment, the Mustang sprang into motion, pivoting with a speed that defied its size. It reared up, hooves flailing, releasing a silent scream into the sky, a cry that Eli could feel reverberating in his bones. The horse slammed its front hooves down in front of the cat, missing it by mere inches. The lion hissed, swiping with razor-sharp claws. The horse spun again, kicking out with its hind legs. The thunderstorm overhead seemed to synchronize with this savage dance. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the scene in stark flashes. Eli pressed himself against a boulder, heart hammering so violently he could feel it in his eardrums. The lion lunged a second time, testing the horse's defenses. The Mustang rose to the challenge, striking with a speed that forced the predator to recoil. In that instant, Eli saw something powerful in the Mustang's eyes, an almost protective fury. He realized, in a flood of relief, that the horse was keeping the lion from reaching him. The standoff felt interminable. Rain started to pelt down in heavy sheets, saturating the earth, creating mud that threatened to pull Eli's boots right off his feet. Wind whipped through the clearing, rattling leaves and branches, adding chaos to the deadly encounter. At last, the mountain lion seemed to decide the horse was not worth the risk. With a guttural snarl, it backed away. Another sharp crack of lightning illuminated its form as it melted into the tree line. Eli didn't move for a long moment, unsure whether the cat might try again. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted to the Mustang. The horse stood with its sides heaving, eyes wide and ears still pinned back. For a second, they simply looked at each other, a boy who couldn't hear and a horse that had just saved his life. Eli took a cautious step forward, glancing toward the direction where the lion had vanished. The Mustang exhaled a heavy breath, as if telling him the danger had passed, for now. The rain hammered down, each drop a cold reminder that the day was far from over. Eli took another step toward the horse. He reached out a trembling hand, a simple gesture of gratitude. The horse snorted but didn't retreat. Eli's fingers made contact with the wet coat, and he felt the powerful muscle quiver under his touch. For an instant, he closed his eyes, anchoring himself in the tangible warmth of the horse's presence. This creature was no ordinary wild Mustang. It had intentionally placed itself between the boy and certain death. Eli knew he couldn't stay in the clearing much longer. The storm showed no signs of relenting, and nightfall would come soon. He looked around, trying to find any semblance of a path, any sign that might lead him back home. But everything was shrouded in a veil of rain and dim light. The Mustang shook its mane and turned, taking a few steps away, then paused to look back at Eli. There was a surprising intelligence in those dark eyes, as though it was beckoning him to follow. With no better option, Eli decided to trust the horse. Maybe it knew this land better than he did. He gathered his courage and followed the Mustang along a narrow, muddy trail. Every few steps, the horse would pause, glance over its shoulder to ensure Eli was still there. Occasionally, a branch would crack in the distance, or lightning would zigzag across the sky, illuminating twisted tree trunks that looked like lurking creatures. The storm turned everything to silhouettes and shadows, making the forest feel alive with hidden watchers. Eli's clothes clung to his skin, water trickling down his neck. His boots squelched in the mud. He tried to keep his balance on the uneven ground, but exhaustion crept in. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since early morning. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. They continued this way for what felt like hours, though it was impossible to measure time in such a storm. At one point, the Mustang led him around a fallen tree, its massive trunk lying across the trail like a blockade. The horse navigated it with ease, stepping over the shattered branches. Eli had to climb, scraping his hands on the slick bark. By the time he managed to get to the other side, his palms were raw. He leaned against the trunk for a moment, trying to catch his breath. He couldn't hear his own panting, but he could feel his lungs burning. The Mustang waited patiently, occasionally flicking its tail against the rain. From the set of its ears, Eli guessed it was growing anxious. The storm had turned from a threat into a merciless assault, and he sensed the horse's urgency. Pressing on, Eli focused on not slipping. The path dipped into a small gully, which now bristled with fast-moving water. The horse picked its way along the edge, careful with each step. Eli's foot sank unexpectedly into the mud, nearly sending him sprawling. He managed to regain his footing, but not before fear spiked in his heart. He glanced at the Mustang, as if seeking reassurance. The horse stopped, gazing at him with a steadiness that somehow soothed him. Maybe, just maybe, they could survive this together. They reached a point where the terrain sloped downward more sharply, forming a shallow ravine. In the downpour, it might offer some shelter. The horse descended, hooves sliding a bit but holding firm. Eli followed, trying to stay close. The wind roared overhead, bending tree branches to their breaking point. After a few perilous minutes, they found a small overhang of rock, just enough to shield them from the worst of the rain. Eli squeezed under it, shivering, teeth chattering with cold. Water dripped relentlessly from the edge of the rock, forming a puddle at his feet. The Mustang stood partially under the overhang, pressing as close as it could without trapping Eli. Night was upon them. The darkness in the ravine was near absolute. The only light came from the intermittent flashes of lightning overhead, each burst revealing the horse's silhouette and the gleam of water cascading down the rock face. Eli tried to still his racing mind. He was lost, soaked to the bone, and with no means of calling for help. Yet a sense of awe remained lodged in his chest. A wild Mustang had saved him from a mountain lion, and was now keeping him company through a raging storm. It felt like a dream conjured by fatigue and fear. But the steady warmth of the horse's body pressed against him was very real. He sat there for a while, hugging himself, keeping his gaze on the mouth of the ravine in case the mountain lion returned. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting with the weather, but no new threats emerged. Eventually, exhaustion weighed heavy on his eyelids. The rhythmic pulse of the horse's breathing lulled him, though he fought to stay awake. Sleep meant vulnerability, and in this treacherous environment, vulnerability could be fatal. Yet he realized he had little choice. If he didn't rest, he'd be too weak to move when dawn arrived. He rested his head against the rock, one hand still touching the horse's damp coat. The Mustang gave a soft huff, almost reassuring, and Eli closed his eyes, slipping into a fitful doze. When he jolted awake, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. The storm had not abated much, but the flashes of lightning were fewer now. He looked around in the near darkness, heart thumping. The Mustang was still there, shifting its weight from one leg to another, ears alert to any potential danger. Eli's body felt stiff and chilled, but he was alive. He pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart, reminding him that he had survived another hour in this savage place. He couldn't hear the rain, but he felt its cold presence as it dripped from his hair and slid down his back. He noticed a few scrapes on his arms, likely from the boulders and branches he had brushed against in his frantic journey. He wondered if anyone back in town realized he was missing. His parents would probably have alerted the local authorities by now. But in a storm like this, search parties might not even be able to track him until the weather eased. He wondered if his father was out there somewhere, stumbling through the dark with a flashlight, calling his name into the raging winds. A flicker of lightning illuminated the horse's dark eyes, reflecting an unspoken question: were they going to move on or stay put? The storm might last until dawn, or it might peter out in a matter of hours. Eli had no way to know. His gut told him they should try to find better shelter or at least keep moving. The temperature was dropping fast, and if they stayed wet and exposed, hypothermia would become a real possibility. Slowly, he reached out and touched the Mustang's neck, feeling the tension in its muscles. The horse seemed to sense his intention, stepping forward out of the shallow cave. Eli took a shaky breath and followed. The ravine floor was slick, water gushing through the rocks. Each step was a calculated risk. More than once, Eli slipped and nearly went down face first, only to catch himself at the last second. The Mustang struggled as well, losing traction momentarily but quickly regaining it. They progressed like this, inch by inch, battered by wind and cold. After a time, the ravine began to slope upward, leading them to higher ground. Eli's legs shook with effort as he clambered over loose stones. The horse snorted, urging him on. They finally emerged onto a plateau where the wind gusted mercilessly. Rain whipped against Eli's face, making it hard to see. He blinked water out of his eyes, scanning the area for any sign of help or shelter. Lightning illuminated a stunted tree bent almost horizontally by the relentless wind. Beyond it, the plateau stretched out in a mess of rocks and puddles, offering no real protection. Farther in the distance, though, he glimpsed a cluster of jagged boulders that might shield them from the wind if they could reach it. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, he trudged forward, the Mustang close by. Step by step, they pressed on until they reached the boulders. They formed a crude wall on the edge of the plateau, not exactly a cave but at least a barrier against the forceful gusts. Eli nestled between two large rocks, the horse standing angled to block the wind's worst blasts from hitting him directly. Now, the temperature felt even lower, like ice water soaking through his clothes. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. He tried rubbing his hands together, blowing on them for warmth, though he couldn't hear the shaky breaths that left his lungs. The Mustang stood watch, occasionally shifting its weight. Eli found himself wondering about the horse's origins. Most wild Mustangs were skittish around people, yet this one had not only tolerated him but protected him. It struck him as almost supernatural, a guardian in equine form. But in the next moment, he remembered the lion's savage lunge, the horse's fearless charge. The memory ignited a spark of gratitude so strong it brought tears to his eyes, though the rain made it impossible to distinguish tears from raindrops. Time blurred. Hours passed, or maybe just minutes. Rain hammered relentlessly. The cold sank deeper into Eli's bones, making it hard to think. His muscles cramped, and he kept rubbing his arms and legs to keep circulation flowing. He tried to push away the numbness creeping over him, focusing instead on the presence of the horse. Every so often, the Mustang would stamp its hoof or toss its head, challenging the storm in its own silent way. Eli found that whenever he was on the brink of despair, the horse's quiet strength anchored him. He began to drift again, caught in a trance-like state between consciousness and exhaustion. He had never felt so powerless. All he could do was wait. In that swirling darkness, images of his family flickered through his mind, his mother's warm smile, his father's strong hands, the way they had always done their best to communicate with him through sign language, gestures, and love. He thought of his little sister, who would wave to get his attention before jabbering excitedly about her day, oblivious to the fact that he couldn't hear her words. He yearned for that innocent warmth, that normalcy. Without warning, he felt something brush against his head. He blinked, startled, and looked up to see the Mustang's muzzle nudging him. The horse's breath was hot against his cold skin. It was as if the animal sensed he was close to giving up. Summoning a scrap of determination, Eli tried to sit up straighter. He mouthed silent words of reassurance to the horse, even though it couldn't understand them. Maybe they gave him courage. The hours bled together in that precarious refuge. He dozed in short spurts, awakened by the relentless cold or another flash of lightning. At one point, he jolted awake to see that the wind had shifted direction, blowing the rain away from their small shelter. A faint gray light in the distance suggested dawn might be approaching. Relief and dread warred inside him. Dawn would bring visibility, but the dropping temperature could bring frost or even snow at higher elevations. Another wave of trembling took hold, and he pressed closer to the horse's side, seeking whatever warmth he could glean. When a pale, watery light finally spread across the plateau, it revealed a changed landscape. The storm still lingered, but its ferocity had diminished. The wind was gentler, and while the rain continued to fall, it was no longer a torrential downpour. Eli rubbed his gritty eyes, feeling a measure of hope trickle in. Survival seemed a fraction more attainable under daylight. He looked at the Mustang, whose coat glistened with water, muscles rippling as it stretched its neck. Standing on shaky legs, Eli peered over the edge of the plateau. Below, an endless sea of pine trees stretched toward a horizon shrouded in mist. He couldn't spot any roads or cabins, no sign of human life. The only thing he could do was pick a direction and trust either his instincts or the horse to guide him. He turned, scanning for a path that looked less steep. The Mustang pawed the ground, snorting. Eli could almost feel the horse urging him to move on. Though he feared the unknown threats that might await them, more predators, more treacherous terrain, staying put meant certain disaster. He took a step, and the Mustang followed. Together, they began their journey into the daylight. Each footfall was like a promise that they wouldn't surrender, that the memory of last night's terror would fuel their determination. The storm might have eased, but the challenges ahead would only grow if they didn't find food, water, and eventually a route back to civilization. Eli's deafness had never felt more isolating. He had to rely on sight, vibration, and sheer intuition to navigate. Yet he wasn't truly alone. He had this wild, untamed ally by his side, an unlikely guardian in a world that had turned savage. As they descended the plateau, the wind continued to gust, scattering droplets of rain in every direction. Eli's tired limbs complained with every step, but he pressed on, clinging to the faint hope that help or safety lay somewhere ahead. The Mustang led the way now, picking a winding path between slick rocks and gnarled roots. At times, the horse would stop abruptly, ears swiveling, as if hearing something Eli could not. He would freeze as well, scanning the area. Once or twice, he thought he caught sight of movement among the trees, but it turned out to be branches swaying or illusions born of fatigue. Hours later, they reached a small stream. The water ran clear, fed by the night's storm. Eli knelt down, scooping water into his mouth, letting the icy liquid soothe his parched throat. He realized how dangerously dehydrated he was. The Mustang also drank, dipping its muzzle into the stream, its sides heaving with each breath. Eli sat back on his heels, feeling a moment of calm. The place was serene, dotted with mossy stones and fluttering leaves. He almost forgot the cold that clung to him. But that feeling vanished when he recalled the mountain lion and the reality that he was still hopelessly lost. He pulled himself up, wincing at the stiffness in his joints. The Mustang lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, ears perked. There was a moment where they looked at each other, as if acknowledging how far they had come since the storm's peak. Eli reached a hand out, stroking the horse's neck, wordlessly thanking it for sticking by him. Once again, the horse turned, indicating a direction deeper into the forest. Eli hesitated, heading farther and seemed counterintuitive, but what choice did he have? He couldn't even be certain which direction led home. Resolving to trust the Mustang, he followed. Their journey became a test of endurance. The storm had taken most of Eli's energy, leaving him with little beyond stubborn willpower. His stomach growled painfully, and his soaked clothes clung to him, sapping warmth. The forest floor was still slippery. He navigated around deep puddles and fallen branches, occasionally stumbling. Each time, the Mustang would slow down, as if keeping an eye on him. Sometimes, a faint sunbeam would pierce the canopy, warming his face for a precious second before vanishing behind thick clouds. They encountered no large predators in those hours, though Eli remained vigilant, scanning every shadow. Once they heard a distant howl. He felt the vibration in his chest. It might have been wolves. The Mustang's ears pricked. It tossed its head, picking up the pace. Eli's heart pounded, recalling all the stories he'd heard about wolf packs in these hills. He pressed forward, anxiety mounting. The wilderness was vast and unforgiving. Each step hammered home the reality that one wrong move could mean their end. Eventually, they stumbled upon a sloping hillside that seemed to lead to a broader valley below. Through the thinning trees, Eli glimpsed rolling grasslands. Hope flickered. Grasslands meant potential vantage points, maybe an easier route for a rescue party to spot him. The Mustang appeared to sense this as well, for it quickened its stride down the slope. Eli followed, nearly losing his footing several times. When at last they reached the bottom, he paused to look around. The valley spread out in a patchwork of tall grass and wildflowers battered by the storm. In the far distance, he could make out ridges and possibly another forest beyond that. Still no visible roads or houses, but it felt more open. If he could traverse this valley, maybe he could circle back toward a main road. But his sense of direction was all but demolished by fatigue and panic. A sudden prickle danced along his neck. The Mustang stiffened, ears angled forward, nostrils flaring. Eli followed the horse's line of sight, scanning the grass. At first, he saw nothing but rippling green blades. Then he caught the faint movement of silhouettes weaving through the grass. Several shapes. His heart lurched. A pack of wolves was making its way through the valley, their heads low, eyes glinting with cunning. They hadn't spotted him yet, but it was only a matter of time. He swallowed, trying to keep his breathing steady. Running would be suicide. The Mustangs seemed to share his alarm, stamping a hoof in agitation. They crouched, creeping through the taller grass toward a clump of rocks. Once hidden behind them, Eli risked a glance back. He could see the outlines of at least 4 wolves, possibly more, moving in formation. Their fur bristled as they sniffed the air. He prayed the wind would carry his scent away rather than straight toward them. For a tense few minutes he watched them pass. His muscles ached from holding still. The Mustang remained beside him, every fiber of its being coiled, ready to defend or flee. Eventually, the wolves disappeared into the distance. Eli let out a silent exhalation of relief, but it was short-lived. They were safe for the moment, but the danger was far from over. He and the Mustang continued across the valley. The grass was drenched, soaking his legs. The sky remained overcast, threatening another downpour. When they reached a slight rise, Eli paused to survey the land. That's when he caught sight of something that made his pulse quicken, fresh hoofprints in the softened ground. Several sets, as though a herd of wild mustangs had passed through recently. But these prints were deeper, more scattered. Could it be that there were other horses, maybe even some belonging to the local ranchers out here? If so, that might lead him closer to inhabited land. The Mustang sniffed at the prints, ears flicking. With new vigor, it pressed forward, following the tracks. Eli trudged behind, ignoring his exhaustion. He was banking on the idea that these tracks would lead them somewhere safer, or at least somewhere less removed from civilization. But as they pushed on, a foreboding sense took hold. The wind carried scents he couldn't discern, but the Mustang was reacting, head tossing and muscles tensing again. They crested another gentle slope and found themselves looking at a group of Mustangs scattered around a clearing, stamping restlessly. Something was off. The horses were bunching up, eyes rolling, snorting in alarm. At the far edge of the clearing, barely visible among the tall grass, lay the body of a fallen mare. Standing near it were figures in dark jackets, armed with rifles. Poachers. Eli felt his stomach twist in horror. It was rumored that unscrupulous hunters sometimes targeted Mustangs for sport or to protect grazing land, but he had never dreamed he would come face to face with them in such dire circumstances. The Mustangs whinnied and pawed the ground. Eli watched as 2 men moved in closer, evidently unafraid of the stampeding potential. They wanted something, maybe hide or some twisted trophy. Eli's Mustang companion froze beside him, half hidden behind some scrub. Its body trembled, more from anger than fear, as if it recognized the scene's atrocity. Without thinking, Eli reached out to steady the horse's flank. He didn't know what to do. Getting involved meant risking his own life, but turning away felt like allowing a crime to continue. The storm had tested his survival instincts, but this was a moral test. He carefully edged backward, guiding the horse away from immediate view. If the poachers spotted them, they'd be in grave danger. As they retreated, a twig snapped under Eli's foot, a tiny sound lost to his deaf ears. But not lost to the men in the clearing. One lifted his head and barked something at the other, scanning the vicinity with narrowed eyes. Eli ducked low, crouching behind the brush, hard hammering. The Mustang flattened its ears, tense and ready to bolt. For a moment, Eli worried the horse would charge right into the clearing out of rage. He gently placed a hand on the Mustang's neck, trying to keep it calm. The men approached, stepping through the grass, rifles raised. Eli gritted his teeth, silently urging the Mustang not to move. The men drew closer, their boots squelching in the mud. Through the leaves, Eli could see their expressions, wary, predatory. It was only a matter of seconds before they would stumble upon him. Then, in a twist of fate, something caused the other Mustangs in the clearing to spook. Maybe the men had gotten too close, or perhaps the wind carried a new scent. The herd erupted, snorting and whinnying, hooves thundering. Distracted by the sudden commotion, the poachers turned and dashed back, yelling commands Eli couldn't hear. The men hurried to corral or chase down the agitated horses, momentarily forgetting the noise they had just heard near the brush. Eli breathed a silent sigh of relief, though he knew this was only a temporary reprieve. He gave the wild Mustang beside him a nudge, urging it to follow. They retreated further, putting distance between themselves and the poachers. Once they were sure they were out of sight, they broke into a careful run, weaving between patches of tall grass and shrubs. Adrenaline spiked through Eli, and his stomach churned at the memory of the fallen mare. This land was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Mountain lions, storms, wolf packs, and now armed poachers. It was as if the entire world had turned savage. When they finally stopped, they found themselves on another hill overlooking a winding river. The Mustang breathed hard, sides heaving. Eli, too, was on the brink of collapse. His body screamed for rest, for warmth, for safety. But there was no time to lament their plight. They needed to keep moving if they wanted to stay ahead of the poachers. He wondered if the men would abandon their gruesome task to track down a lone horse and a frightened boy. Perhaps they wouldn't bother, perhaps they would. He dared not gamble with his life on that assumption. Gazing at the river below, Eli weighed his options. Crossing it might be risky in the storm-swollen waters, but it could also hide their tracks. The Mustang nickered softly, as though encouraging him. With a final glance behind, ensuring the poachers were nowhere in sight, Eli led the horse down the slope. The river ran faster than usual, fed by the torrents of rain. The water was dark, churning with debris. Eli's heart clenched at the thought of wading through it, but the alternative was to circle around for who knew how many miles, potentially running into the poachers again. Summoning courage, he stepped into the current, boots instantly soaked. The Mustang followed, picking its steps carefully. At times, Eli had to brace himself against the horse's flank to keep from being swept away. The water rose to his waist, ice-cold and forceful. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward, every muscle straining. Midway through, the current swelled, nearly knocking Eli off his feet. He clung to the Mustang, which stumbled but pressed on. For a terrifying moment, he was underwater, swirling in dark chaos, but he managed to surface and grab hold of the horse's mane. With a powerful surge, the Mustang lunged ahead, dragging Eli with it. They stumbled onto the opposite bank, collapsing in a soaked heap on the muddy shore. Eli coughed, expelling the water he'd inhaled. Despite his deafness, he sensed the roar of the river behind him, an unrelenting force of nature that had almost claimed them. Breathing hard, he looked at the Mustang, which stood trembling, water streaming from its coat. Eli reached out a hand, grateful beyond words. The horse shook its head, almost as though to say, "We have to keep going." And keep going they did, forcing themselves to their feet, pressing into a thicket of trees to remain hidden. Every step felt like a battle. Fatigue weighed on Eli's body, but something stronger, an instinct to survive, drove him on. Occasionally, he would pause behind a thick trunk, scanning the horizon for signs of movement. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, though the sky remained an iron curtain overhead. At long last, they emerged onto a small meadow. The grass here was shorter, well-trodden, hinting that it might be closer to human habitation. Eli's eyes combed the scenery, and there, near the far edge, he spotted what appeared to be a footpath. Relief flared in him. A path might lead to a road, which might lead to rescue. Though every muscle in his body screamed for rest, he gestured to the Mustang, who seemed to understand. Together, they followed the narrow trail as it weaved among stunted bushes and low-hanging trees. Bit by bit, the terrain grew friendlier, the undergrowth less dense. Through the thinning canopy, Eli glimpsed a gray sky laced with the pale glow of nearing dusk. They had survived one night already, and it seemed they would have to weather a second. But at least they were moving in what he hoped was a direction toward home or help. Each step was an affirmation. He was alive, and he had a fierce, brave companion at his side. The memory of the mountain lion, the storm, and the horrifying sight of the poachers lurked in his mind, fueling his desperation to find safety. They continued until darkness began to blanket the land again. With limited visibility, Eli searched for a secure place to rest. He eventually found a thick cluster of pines that formed a natural alcove. The ground beneath them was relatively dry, shielded by the dense branches overhead. He coaxed the Mustang to settle there with him. Curling up against the horse's flank, he tried to conserve body heat. A dull ache spread through every part of him. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. He prayed for dawn to come quickly, prayed that the next day would bring a rescue party, or at least a sign that civilization was not far off. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the boy, deaf to the world, found solace in the steady rhythm of the Mustang's breathing. A bond had formed that transcended words or even conscious understanding. In the face of relentless danger, they had only each other. And though he couldn't articulate it in sound, Eli's heart was screaming with gratitude. He vowed that if he ever made it back home, he wouldn't forget what this horse had done for him. He would tell anyone who would listen about the wild Mustang that had saved his life. When morning arrived, it came quietly, with only a subtle shift in the light that filtered through the pine branches. Eli stirred, stiff and aching. The Mustang was already awake, ears pricked, listening for potential threats. The rain had stopped at last, leaving the forest floor glistening with water droplets. Eli crawled out from under the pines, shaking needles from his clothes. His throat felt parched again, and his stomach felt like a hollow pit. He ran a hand through his damp hair, steeling himself to continue. One more day. One more push. Maybe that would be enough to find his way home. He squinted toward the path they'd followed, noticing that it continued winding up a gentle slope. Summoning what remained of his courage and physical strength, he signaled the Mustang to follow. The horse stepped out from the alcove, shaking the dew from its mane. Together, they resumed their journey, each step a testament to their resilience. The path meandered through patches of wild berry bushes, though Eli wasn't sure which ones were safe to eat. Desperation made him pluck a few, nibbling cautiously. The tart juice stung his empty belly, but it was better than nothing. He offered some to the horse out of habit, though he knew the animal would graze on grass if it could. A few hours later, just as Eli began to fear the path would lead to nowhere, he glimpsed a signpost, a small, weathered marker planted at a fork in the trail. Heart pounding, he approached it. Years of traveling with his father to various campgrounds had taught him to recognize certain trail signs. Though the lettering was faded, he could just make out an arrow pointing left, with the name of a lookout point. Another arrow pointed right, directing travelers toward a local lake. Eli's mind spun with possibilities. If there was a lookout point, it might have a ranger station or a vantage from which he could spot the town or a major road. Without hesitation, he took the left path. The Mustang followed closely, as though it, too, sensed they might finally be nearing a break in their ordeal. Eli's body ached with fatigue, but the promise of an overlook fueled him. The trail rose steadily, switchbacking up the slope. Occasionally, he had to stop and catch his breath, leaning on the trunk of a sturdy pine. The Mustang would wait patiently, scanning the surroundings for danger. The land became rockier as they climbed, large slabs jutting out of the earth, requiring careful footing. At one point, the Mustang nearly lost its balance on a loose stone, but it recovered gracefully. Eli felt a surge of alarm at the thought of the horse being injured after everything they'd been through. When they finally emerged onto a ledge, the view took his breath away. Rolling hills extended in every direction, patches of forest giving way to open plains. In the far distance, he saw what could only be the faint outline of a town, a scattering of buildings at the base of a distant ridge. Relief ballooned in his chest. Though it was still miles away, he had a direction now, a tangible goal. He glanced at the Mustang, grin quirking his lips despite his exhaustion. He traced a potential route in his mind's eye, looking for valleys and trails that might lead him to that collection of rooftops. He noticed a large river snaking across the plains, likely the same one they had crossed, but it seemed gentler in sections. Possibly there was a bridge or a shallow crossing near the town. Still, it was a daunting distance to cover on foot, especially in his weakened state. Yet the relief of merely seeing a sign of civilization revitalized him. He began his descent, scanning for the safest path. The Mustang followed without hesitation. Hours melted away as they traversed ridges and meadows, carefully making their way downhill. The sun climbed higher, warming Eli's face. Though the memory of the storm and its icy dread clung to him, the brightness of the day rekindled hope. He imagined reuniting with his parents, telling them about the Mustang's bravery. Perhaps he'd find a rancher or a veterinarian to tend to the horse if it was injured. Every so often, he'd look at the Mustang, checking for limps or cuts. Apart from a few scrapes, it seemed to be holding up remarkably well. As they reached lower elevation, the forest thinned, opening up to rolling grasslands again. Eli scanned the horizon for signs of roads, search parties, or anything that would confirm he was heading in the right direction. Then, he saw movement far off in the distance, specks that moved in formation. Could it be a group of riders or vehicles? Squinting, he couldn't quite discern. But it was enough to spur him on. He quickened his pace, ignoring the burning in his calves and the dryness in his throat. The day drifted into afternoon. Eli and the Mustang pressed on, weaving between grassy knolls. Several times he stopped to check if the specks in the distance were getting closer, but he lost sight of them. The terrain dipped, hiding them from view. Then, as they crested yet another small rise, he saw the flicker of a reflection, sunlight bouncing off metal. It was definitely a vehicle, perhaps more than one. His heart soared, and he broke into a stumbling run, the Mustang galloping a few paces to catch up. They rushed down into a shallow gulch, back up the other side, adrenaline pushing aside exhaustion. When he finally reached the top, he froze. A line of vehicles, trucks and an old Jeep, were parked along a dirt path. People stood beside them, some with flashlights in their hands, a few on horseback. It was a search party. He recognized one of them, even at a distance, his father. The man stood with a rifle slung over his shoulder, posture tense. Eli's eyes flooded with tears. He waved his arms wildly, trying to catch their attention. But no one turned his way. He realized that from their vantage he might be lost in the long grass. He whistled, forgetting momentarily that he couldn't hear it himself, and then remembered to wave more dramatically. Still no response. The Mustang took matters into its own hooves, breaking into a spirited run across the field. Eli stumbled after it as fast as he could, arms flailing. Within seconds the search party saw the approaching horse and erupted into frantic movement. Eli saw his father whip around, eyes widening. Another man lifted binoculars, scanning the horizon. And then suddenly, they spotted him, Eli drenched, caked in mud, stumbling but alive. Shouts broke out. People rushed forward, calling out his name. His father led the charge, boots pounding the earth. Though Eli couldn't hear the joyful cries, he could see the relief etched on their faces. He ran to meet them halfway, collapsing into his father's arms. It felt like a dream, the warmth of his father's embrace after that endless night of cold and terror. As they held each other, the Mustang skidded to a stop a few yards away, sides heaving. Others in the search party hesitated, eyeing the wild horse warily. The Mustang pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, still not entirely trusting these newcomers. Eli's father signed frantically to him, tears in his eyes, hands trembling with both relief and worry. Eli tried to explain that the Mustang had saved his life, but in his emotional state, the signs came out jumbled. Eventually, the men approached carefully, and the Mustang tossed its head but didn't bolt. It stayed, as though it recognized that Eli was safe now, and it wanted to confirm that the danger was truly over. One of the men, a local rancher, made a move to rope the horse. Eli shook his head vehemently, signing, "No!" repeatedly. He placed himself between the Mustang and the man, trying to convey that it was a friend, not a wild beast to be captured. The rancher gave a startled look, then lowered the rope, stepping back. Onlookers stared in astonishment at how the horse stood protectively behind Eli. Whispers rippled through the group. People were in awe that a wild Mustang had kept the boy alive, had fought off predators, and guided him through the storm. Then, just as the tension eased, the Mustang shifted, lifting a hind leg gingerly. Eli noticed a nasty scrape along its flank that he hadn't seen before, likely a wound from the rocky terrain or possibly the struggle with the mountain lion. The horse was clearly favoring that leg. Eli's father, catching on, gestured for one of the search party members to grab a first aid kit. A few men moved slowly, as not to spook the injured Mustang. They offered gentle touches, quietly trying to tend to the wound. The horse trembled, uncertain, but allowed them to apply a disinfectant. Eli stood by, stroking the animal's neck, his silent presence calming it. Meanwhile, people peppered his father with questions. How did he survive out here? Was the horse really with him the whole time? Is he hurt? The father signed back, explaining the best he could, though he was still taking in the enormity of the situation himself. Eli was too weary to piece together a coherent story in sign language right now. He just sank to the ground next to the Mustang, leaning against its warm body. His father knelt beside him, draping a coat over his shoulders, brushing wet hair from his face. He mouthed words of reassurance, tears brimming in his eyes. Eli had never felt such overwhelming relief. Within minutes, they realized they needed to transport the Mustang and Eli back to town. One of the men fetched a horse trailer from a truck. The idea of loading a wild Mustang into a trailer was daunting, but the horse was surprisingly docile, perhaps too exhausted to fight. Eli's father coaxed it forward, leading it with gentle pressure and calm gestures. The horse hesitated at the trailer ramp, snorting. Eli, though exhausted, rose to his feet and placed a hand on the Mustang's muzzle, guiding it forward. The horse trusted him enough to take those steps. Once inside, it stomped its hooves but eventually settled. Eli was lifted gently into one of the trucks, wrapped in blankets. The entire search party breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had found the missing boy, and an unlikely hero. As they rumbled back toward town along the winding dirt road, Eli stared through the window at the passing landscape. Each tree and rock felt like a memory of terror and determination. He couldn't hear the hum of the engine or the low murmur of the men's voices, but he felt the vibration of the road beneath him and watched raindrops streak across the glass. Before long, the adrenaline started to ebb, replaced by bone-deep fatigue. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the blankets lull him into a dreamless sleep. When he awoke, the truck was rolling through the familiar streets of his hometown. Townspeople lined the sidewalks, many of them wearing anxious, expectant expressions. Word had spread that Eli was found alive. Several onlookers craned their necks to see the horse trailer, curious about the rumored wild Mustang. The truck finally stopped in front of the local veterinary clinic, a modest building with a whitewashed exterior. Eli's father helped him out, while the vet and a few assistants hurried to the trailer. Carefully, they lowered the ramp. The Mustang stepped out, ears flicking back as it took in the unfamiliar surroundings. It seemed spooked by the crowd, rearing slightly, but Eli quickly stepped forward, resting a hand on the horse's neck. Gradually it calmed. A hush settled over the gathering townspeople. To see a scrawny, mud-splattered teenage boy, a boy who couldn't hear, and a wild Mustang standing side by side in the middle of Main Street was enough to take anyone's breath away. Murmurs rippled. That's the Walker kid. Is he really deaf? How'd he tame that horse? Through the crowd, a small figure burst forth, Eli's younger sister, tears streaming down her cheeks. She flung her arms around him. He hugged her back, trembling with emotion. Their parents stood by, eyes brimming with gratitude. Inside the clinic's yard, the vet began a preliminary examination of the Mustang. A few townsfolk wanted to watch, but the vet insisted on giving the horse room to avoid causing more stress. Eli hovered near, refusing to leave the Mustang's side. The vet checked the horse's vitals, examined the scrapes, and gave instructions for cleaning and dressing the wounds. It would take time and care, but the horse would likely recover. While this unfolded, Eli's father pulled him aside and gently asked him to explain what had happened. With trembling hands, Eli signed out the harrowing tale: the sudden storm, getting lost, the mountain lion's attack, the Mustang's intervention, the flight through the ravine, the river crossing, encountering poachers. Each sign was charged with the memory of life and death stakes. His father's face paled, tears threatening to spill. He pulled Eli into a tight hug. Townsfolk nearby caught snippets of the story, and shock spread like wildfire. The idea that a wild Mustang had saved a deaf boy from a mountain lion and then shielded him from other threats, mounting evidence that this was a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. Word traveled fast. By evening, crowds had gathered around the clinic, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Mustang. The mayor came by, offering to recognize both boy and horse in a civic ceremony. A local news reporter showed up with a camera, seeking an interview. Eli felt overwhelmed, drained from the ordeal and the sudden attention. He kept close to the Mustang, which paced in its stall, anxious in the presence of so many strangers. The vet suggested sedation, but Eli insisted the horse remain conscious unless absolutely necessary. He worried it might wake up disoriented and terrified, especially without him nearby. That night, the town collectively held its breath. A group of volunteers set up a space in the veterinary barn for Eli to sleep, because he refused to go home and leave the Mustang behind. His parents brought him fresh clothes, soup, and bread. He ate ravenously, realizing just how starved he was. Meanwhile, the Mustang dozed fitfully, ears twitching at every sound, though there was a gentleness in its demeanor whenever Eli approached. More than one onlooker remarked on the uncanny bond forming between them. After all, Mustangs typically shied away from humans, yet this one seemed to accept Eli's presence, as though they shared an unbreakable trust. With the crisis of survival behind him, the reality of what he had endured began to sink in. Eli found himself trembling at random intervals, recalling the lion's piercing gaze or the roar of the flooded river. He felt the absence of sound more acutely than ever, as if every terrifying moment had been magnified by silence. But each time his anxiety flared, he would look at the Mustang and draw strength from the memory of how they had persevered together. Sleep came sporadically, haunted by vivid dreams of prowling shadows and raging storms. Morning arrived, bringing with it a sense of hopeful calm. The storm clouds had vanished, replaced by a clear blue sky. The sun poured into the barn, illuminating dust motes in the air. Eli woke to find the Mustang nuzzling his shoulder, as if to say good morning. The tenderness of the gesture made his chest tighten with gratitude. The vet entered, carrying a bucket of warm mash mixed with oats for the horse, and some medical supplies to recheck the wound. Eli stood by, stroking the Mustang's mane, while the vet gently cleaned and dressed the scrape. Outside, the murmurs of townspeople gathered again, eager for updates. When the vet finished, Eli led the Mustang into a small corral behind the clinic. The sun felt glorious on his skin after so many hours of cold, fear, and cramped quarters. The Mustang sniffed the air, taking a few tentative steps before trotting around the perimeter. People clung to the fence, awed by the sight. Eli's father joined him inside, signing, "The mayor wants to do a ceremony for you and the horse. Something about awarding you both for bravery. Are you up for it?" Eli looked at the Mustang, then back at his father, uncertain. A part of him appreciated the gesture, but he also knew how stressful all these onlookers would be for the horse. He nodded reluctantly, figuring it might be the only way to ensure the town recognized the horse's heroism and protected it from future harm. Word spread, and by late afternoon, a makeshift platform had been set up outside the clinic. The entire town seemed to gather, from curious children to the local elders. Eli stood on the platform with his parents and the mayor, who spoke into a microphone that Eli couldn't hear. The Mustang stayed at Eli's side, ears flicking nervously at the crowd. The mayor's words, translated into sign language by a teacher from Eli's school, told of courage, survival, and the unbreakable bond between a boy and a wild horse. Applause erupted, startling the Mustang, which skittered sideways. Eli quickly calmed it with a soothing touch. Then, the mayor gestured for Eli's father to come forward. He spoke of the boy's extraordinary resolve and the horse's near-miraculous actions. Finally, he called upon the ranchers and the townspeople to promise protection for the herd of wild mustangs that roamed the nearby hills. The crowd erupted again in cheers. Eli sensed the vibration of the stomping, the jubilant shouts he couldn't quite hear. He smiled, tears threatening to spill over, overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of gratitude. His father wrapped an arm around him, beaming with pride. Once the ceremony concluded, townsfolk surged forward to congratulate him and stroke the Mustang's muzzle. The horse tolerated a few cautious touches, but Eli could tell it was getting overwhelmed. He led it away from the crowd, finding a quieter spot behind the platform. He pressed his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the steady warmth of its body. The Mustang exhaled softly, its breath ruffling Eli's hair. It was a moment of private communion amidst the public spectacle, a reminder of their shared journey through life-threatening adversity. Days passed, and Eli spent much of his time at the clinic, helping the vet care for the horse's injury. Each morning, more and more people came to take photos, marvel at the bond, and share the story on social media or with neighboring towns. Some even arrived from out of state, having heard rumors of the deaf boy and the wild Mustang that braved storms, lions, and wolves. The local newspaper published a front-page story titled, "A Wild Mustang Saved a Deaf Boy. What Happened Next Left the Town in Shock," capturing the essence of their incredible survival tale. Donations poured in, with people offering to cover vet bills and volunteering to help track down the poachers rumored to be operating in the area. Eli's father, deeply moved by the horse's bravery, began advocating for stronger protections for the local Mustang herds. He reached out to wildlife organizations and fellow ranchers, hoping to form a coalition. His argument was simple: if a wild Mustang could display such loyalty and intelligence, then surely these animals deserved careful management and safeguarding from harm. Public sentiment was on his side, fueled by the emotional impact of Eli's story. Soon, petitions were circulating, local boards were holding special meetings, and the future for the Mustang population began to look a little brighter. Meanwhile, Eli often found himself replaying the events in his mind: the deafening silence of the storm, the thunder he could only feel, the lion's predatory movements, the moment the Mustang charged to defend him. He realized just how close he had come to death countless times out there. The memory of that raw terror haunted him, but it also forged a sense of inner strength he had never felt before. At night, when he closed his eyes, he sometimes felt the old panic swell up, a suffocating reminder of the raging river or the poacher's rifles. But then he would remember the horse standing strong, staring down danger, its eyes full of unwavering resolve. In the weeks following his rescue, Eli recovered physically. Small cuts and bruises faded, and his body, though still a bit thin from lack of proper food and days of stress, regained strength. The Mustang's wound healed under the vet's watchful eye, leaving a faint scar that would forever mark its ordeal. A question loomed over everyone's mind: should the horse be released back into the wild herd, or should it remain under human care? Opinions were divided. Some argued that a wild Mustang should remain free, while others believed its close bond with Eli and familiarity with humans now made it less suitable for life in the wild. Eli himself was torn. He wanted the horse to be free, to gallop across the open meadows with the herd where it belonged. But he also couldn't bear the thought of parting ways forever. They had formed a bond sealed by survival, something that transcended ownership. He confided in his father about these conflicting emotions, tears trickling down his cheeks as he signed, "I don't know what's best for him. I just don't want to lose him." His father hugged him close, signing, "Maybe you won't have to. Let's see if we can find a middle ground." And so they consulted with the vet, wildlife experts, and even ranchers experienced with Mustangs. They laid out a plan. The horse would be given a large, safe pasture near the edge of the town, one that bordered the wild range. It could come and go as it pleased, ensuring it could rejoin the herd if it chose but still remain close to Eli. The townsfolk rallied behind the plan, donating funds and labor to fence off a sizable piece of land, install watering troughs, and ensure the Mustang had room to roam. Some worried the horse might simply disappear into the wild once healed, never to return. Eli accepted that risk, The horse had already given him more than he could ever repay. When the day came to release the Mustang into the new pasture, half the town showed up to watch. The gate was opened, and everyone fell silent. The horse stepped forward, sniffing the air, clearly sensing the open space beyond. It trotted out into the pasture, head high, tail swishing. For a moment, Eli's heart clenched, anticipating the Mustang might gallop away and never look back. Instead, after a brief run, the horse paused, turned, and looked straight at Eli standing by the fence. It whinnied softly, a sound Eli could only feel as a gentle vibration in his chest. He smiled, signing a silent thank you. The Mustang nickered again, then turned and trotted off, exploring its new domain. The town continued to reel in amazement at how these events had unfolded: a deaf boy lost in the wilderness, a savage storm, deadly predators, ruthless poachers, and in the midst of it all, a wild Mustang that had guided him through every peril. It challenged people's perceptions of wild animals and made them question long-held assumptions about Mustangs as feral nuisances. For Eli, it was far more personal. Surviving such an ordeal changed him, imbuing him with a quiet confidence that had been missing before. He came to realize that even without hearing, he had the capacity to read the land, sense danger, and connect with creatures in a profound way. His disability, long a source of insecurity, began to feel more like a unique lens through which he experienced the world. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond the region. A national news program interviewed him, with his father interpreting his signs. Wildlife organizations reached out, eager to feature the tale in their documentaries about Mustang conservation. Even authors and filmmakers expressed interest in adapting it into a feature-length narrative. Through it all, Eli remained humble, deflecting the spotlight onto the horse rather than himself. He was just a boy who got lost, he insisted. The Mustang was the true hero. Eventually, life settled into a new rhythm. Eli returned to school, though classmates now viewed him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The Mustang took to roaming the new pasture, occasionally vanishing into the wild for a few days before returning. Each time it came back, Eli would hurry to the fence, and the horse would nuzzle his hands, as though greeting an old friend. Word of the boy-and-horse bond continued to draw tourists, but Eli never let it become a spectacle. This was personal, a friendship born in the crucible of survival. In time, the scars faded and the winter snows arrived. The Mustang's coat grew thicker, and Eli's heart felt fuller. He had confronted his own fragility out there in the wilderness, and emerged changed. When people asked him how it felt to be a local legend, he would just smile and shrug. He hadn't done anything extraordinary, he had only lived. If pressed for a deeper explanation, he would sign something like, "That horse taught me how to fight for my life. I owe him everything." Looking back, the town remained in shock at how all the pieces fit together: a raging storm that isolated a deaf teenager, a savage mountain lion that almost ended him, the unlikeliest of saviors emerging from the wild, the near-mythic journey through predators and poachers, all culminating in a rescue that reaffirmed the goodness that could exist between man and beast. People told the story in hushed tones at the diner, in excited chatter at the school, in proud declarations to neighboring towns. Some facts got exaggerated, rumors of the horse wrestling a bear or the boy surviving a fall off a cliff. But at its heart, the truth was enough: a boy and a Mustang, bound by fate, overcame impossible odds. In the quiet early morning, before the rest of the town stirred, Eli would often slip out to the pasture. He'd climb the fence and wait. Sometimes the Mustang was there, grazing in the soft light of dawn. Sometimes it wasn't, off roaming the highlands. But whenever it returned, it trotted over to him, nudging his shoulder, and he would rest his forehead against its muzzle. In the deafening silence of those moments, there was an unspoken conversation, a mutual respect, and a gratitude that ran deeper than words or even signs could convey. They didn't need to speak. They had shared a harrowing chapter of life and emerged standing, side by side. So if you found this story meaningful, if you felt your heart pound at every turn, if you felt hope blossom in the face of overwhelming odds, then please like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you incredible stories like this one every day, And who knows, maybe the next one will inspire you to see the world in a different light. After all, courage, loyalty, and hope can show up in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes you find the best of humanity in the eyes of a wild Mustang.